there have been several significant new developments in the investigation into the tragic and deeply unsettling death of Celeste Rivas, developments that paint an even more disturbing picture of what may have happened in the days and possibly months leading up to the discovery of her remains. According to information obtained by TMZ, Celeste's body had been frozen for an extended and still undetermined period of time before authorities ever located it. When investigators finally came across the remains inside the trunk of David's vehicle, they found that the body was still partially frozen, suggesting prolonged storage under extremely low temperatures. This chilling detail has added an entirely new layer of complexity to a case that already carried numerous unanswered questions. Sources with direct knowledge of the investigation say the condition of the remains was so profoundly compromised due to both the freezing and what appears to be deliberate dismemberment that the medical examiner may never be able to conclusively determine the actual cause of death. The freezing not only preserved certain parts of the body, but also obscured crucial forensic markers that examiners typically rely on to identify signs of trauma. As a result, investigators are left with a highly challenging, almost puzzle-like set of evidence in which many key pieces are missing or damaged beyond recognition. These new revelations have shifted the tone of the investigation dramatically. What initially appeared to be a potential missing person case has now escalated into a multi-layered forensic inquiry, one complicated by the unusual handling of the remains, the timeline of when the body was moved, and the lingering question of why someone would go to such lengths to freeze and store a body. Law enforcement officials have been working tirelessly to reconstruct the sequence of events leading up to the discovery, and each new detail seems to open yet another area of uncertainty. What investigators have uncovered so far points toward a meticulously concealed crime, one that may have involved planning, access to specialized equipment, and knowledge of how freezing affects decomposition. And yet, despite the fragments of information that have surfaced, the core mystery remains. How did Celeste die, and why were such extreme measures taken afterward? Authorities are continuing to pursue leads, but the damaged state of the remains has made the path to answers far more complicated than anyone initially anticipated. When Celeste's body was finally discovered, investigators were confronted with a scene far more gruesome and disturbing than early reports had suggested. The physical condition of the remains was significantly worse than anyone had anticipated. Not only had the body been deliberately dismembered, her head removed and her arms and legs separated from the torso, but the severed limbs showed signs of severe damage. According to sources familiar with the case, the injuries were consistent with both the effects of prolonged freezing and the method used to cut the body apart, indicating that whoever was responsible had taken considerable steps to hinder decomposition and obscure evidence. All of the body parts were located together in the trunk of David's vehicle, and investigators were struck by the fact that they were still partially frozen when found. This level of freezing, even after being exposed to fluctuating temperatures inside a car, immediately raised questions about how long the body had been stored in a freezer and at what temperature. Authorities now believe the remains had been inside the vehicle for several days before the car was eventually towed to an impound lot, suggesting that the body had spent a significant amount of time locked inside the trunk while still retaining the deep chill of extended refrigeration. What made the discovery even more suspicious was that despite spending days inside the trunk and additional hours sitting in the impound yard under normal weather conditions, the remains had not fully thawed. Investigators view this as a critical detail, one that strongly supports the theory that the body was kept in a powerful freezer, likely an industrial or commercial-grade unit, before being moved into the vehicle. The level of cold preservation observed would have required far more than a household freezer, further implying intent, preparation, and access to specialized equipment. This unusual state of partial freezing has become one of the most important forensic clues in the case, shaping investigators' understanding of the timeline and the possible movements of both the body and the suspects involved. It suggests that whoever handled Celeste's remains may have transported them shortly after removing them from a long-term freezing environment, an act that adds an additional layer of mystery and raises even more questions about what truly happened to Celeste Rivas and why such extreme measures were taken to conceal the truth. Sources say that when Celeste's remains were first transported to the medical examiner's office in early September, investigators immediately classified the case as a likely homicide. The reason was straightforward. The dismemberment was not consistent with any natural process or accidental circumstance. It indicated purposeful human involvement, and from the beginning, authorities believed they were dealing with a deliberate and potentially calculated act. However, despite the initial certainty surrounding the manner in which the body had been handled, determining how Celeste actually died has become an unexpectedly difficult challenge for the medical examiner. According to individuals familiar with the ongoing forensic analysis, the medical examiner is now facing multiple obstacles that complicate the process of identifying the true cause of death. The remains suffered extreme physical damage, not only from being cut apart, but also from the prolonged freezing that preserved certain tissues while destroying others. Freezing can severely distort or conceal key indicators of fatal injury, such as bruising, internal bleeding, or subtle forms of trauma that typically guide examiners toward a clear conclusion. In this case, the freezing, the dismemberment, and the subsequent thawing have all contributed to a body that no longer presents the usual forensic clues. Experts explain that when remains are frozen for long periods, vital forensic details can be lost entirely. Tissue can crack, organs can become distorted, and microscopic evidence can be obliterated. Combined with extensive cutting, some of which may have occurred after death, the examiner is left with an incomplete and highly compromised set of physical indicators. Each attempt to identify patterns or injuries has been met with conflicting or inconclusive results. Because of these unprecedented challenges, officials now caution that the final autopsy report may ultimately classify the cause of death as undetermined. This designation is used only in cases where the available evidence is too damaged, incomplete, or altered to support a medically reliable conclusion. It does not mean foul play is ruled out, only that the body no longer contains the identifiable markers needed to specify the precise manner of death. For investigators, this possibility is deeply frustrating, as an undetermined cause can complicate the legal process even when homicide is strongly suspected based on the condition and handling of the remains. Authorities have already identified David as a primary suspect in the case, and that status has remained unchanged despite the ongoing forensic challenges. Even if the medical examiner is ultimately unable to determine the exact cause of death, both the LAPD and the LA County District Attorney's Office can still move forward with criminal charges based on the totality of evidence, behavior, and circumstances surrounding Celeste's disappearance and the handling of her remains. The LAPD continues to classify the investigation as a homicide, and detectives have shifted considerable attention to a suspicious late-night trip David allegedly took last spring. According to investigative records, he traveled to a remote and isolated area of Santa Barbara County, an area known for its rugged terrain and limited public access, raising questions about whether the location played a role in the disposal, temporary storage, or movement of the body. In addition to David, sources have also confirmed the presence of a second suspect, someone investigators believe played a direct role in the dismemberment of Celeste's body. The existence of this second individual significantly expands the scope of the case, suggesting potential collaboration, planning, or at the very least, a coordinated effort to conceal what happened. While the LAPD has not yet revealed the identity of this person, the agency is said to be tracking their movements, communications, and possible involvement across multiple stages of the timeline. Mark Garagos, my co-host on the Two Angry Men podcast and a seasoned attorney with decades of experience handling high-profile criminal cases, noted in our latest episode that his sources indicate this second suspect is not just being examined for dismemberment after the fact. Instead, investigators are exploring the possibility that this individual may have been involved in events before Celeste's death, during the critical moments in which she likely died, and in the extensive efforts made afterward to hide or dispose of her remains. Garagos stated that the LAPD already knows exactly who this person is, and he himself is aware of their identity, but he is choosing not to disclose the name publicly due to the ongoing nature of the investigation and the potential legal implications. This revelation introduces a troubling and complex question that investigators are still working to unravel. If detectives believe the body was taken to Santa Barbara at some point, possibly buried, hidden, or stored there, how did it later reappear in Los Angeles inside the trunk of David's vehicle, several months after Celeste was last seen alive? The movement of the body suggests a deliberate and calculated series of actions, possibly involving transportation across multiple counties and coordination between more than one person. It also hints at the possibility that the remains were stored, retrieved, and relocated with care and intention, raising even more disturbing questions about who was involved, what they were trying to hide, and why the body ultimately ended up where it was found. This unanswered question, how the body made the journey from rural Santa Barbara back to Los Angeles, has now become one of the central mysteries in the case, and solving it may be key to understanding the full scope of the crime. Based on the evidence gathered so far, investigators believe the most plausible explanation is that Celeste's remains were stored in a freezer, likely a large, commercial-grade or industrial-style unit, for an extended period of time. This type of freezer is capable of reaching temperatures far below what a standard household freezer can achieve, which would explain the extreme level of preservation observed. Sources say the body was so thoroughly frozen that even after being moved into the trunk of David's car, it took an extraordinarily long time to begin thawing. In fact, when authorities eventually discovered the remains at the impound lot, the body still had not fully thawed, despite having spent days inside the vehicle and hours sitting in a tow yard under normal environmental conditions. This detail has become a cornerstone of the investigation, as it strongly reinforces law enforcement's theory that the freezing was not incidental or accidental, but intentional. The extended preservation suggests a deliberate effort to conceal the timeline of death, destroy potential forensic evidence, or prevent the natural decomposition that would normally offer investigators clues. What remains unclear and deeply unsettling is why the body was stored in this way, for how long, and who had access to the specialized equipment required to freeze a human body to such an extreme degree. At this stage, it is becoming increasingly likely that the medical examiner may never be able to determine exactly how Celeste Rivas died. The remains were damaged on multiple levels, frozen solid for an unknown length of time, then thawed unevenly, and ultimately dismembered with enough force and precision to destroy many of the forensic markers examiners rely on to identify signs of fatal injury. These overlapping factors have created a situation in which the physical evidence may simply be too compromised to allow for a definitive conclusion. If that happens, the final autopsy report may forever leave the true cause of death unknown. Despite this significant forensic setback, the homicide investigation remains active and far from stalled. Detectives are continuing to pursue multiple leads, track the movements of key suspects, analyze surveillance footage, review communication records, and build a detailed timeline of events stretching from the weeks before Celeste's disappearance to the eventual discovery of her frozen remains. With two suspects already in focus and several unanswered questions still driving the inquiry, law enforcement appears determined to uncover the truth, even without a clear medical explanation for how Celeste Rivas died.